Hello, everybody, and good evening. My name's Don Arleth, and it's time for another round of World Talks here on TVP World. As Donald Trump is in his third week as President of the United States, it is still unclear just how hawkish the new administration will be to what many consider as one of the biggest threats America will face in the 20th century. That is China. The ban on Tik Tok has been delayed and the tariffs put in place. But what else should we expect and can we expect from Trump 47? Joining me now to discuss is research professor at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, Ellis. Good evening, sir, and thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Yes, and for us as well. Thank you very much. Now, China and the United States, they compete on several levels, whether it be militarily or economically. In which area of competition would you expect to see, the toughest competition between the United States and China during Trump's last term?
Well, the best answer is to say all of them, but it's important to recognize that first, President Trump, as a businessman, like in his first administration, is going to lead with trade, the war with respect to tariffs and looking to the China market and addressing deficits. But in addition to that, you have the military competition that we have talked about before, the competition for military technologies, for military position, and in specific areas, whether that's the Navy in the Indo-Pacific, and also related issues of technology, especially competing in areas such as chips, artificial intelligence, etc. But beyond that, especially in other regions of the world, I think you can expect to see a competition with respect to commerce, with respect to things like strategic minerals, logistics, supply chains, ports, and certainly digital infrastructure. And also, I think you can see secondarily a political competition in institutions, a competition for influence in places like Latin America, and frankly, a competition against Chinese encroachment with what they like to call people to people, but which one might think about as networks of personal business and other types of more nefarious influence.
By executive order, Donald Trump just recently withdrew from the World Health Organization, from the Human Rights Council within the United Nations, the UNRWA. Is this a good approach to essentially withdraw from certain institutions who, I understand the argument, have been poisoned by some bad actors? I understand also that the United States is the biggest funder for many of these institutions, but is this the good approach to simply leave because you don't like what's going on in there?
Well, it's certainly a matter of debate, and one can recognize that the Chinese, going back many years, have long used their bureaucratic skills to try to dominate those institutions and co-opt their agendas, as we've seen with the World Health Organization in the battle against COVID-19 and the messaging on that, as well as in some other areas. I think the issue is not to cede all spaces, and one can certainly debate whether it's good or bad, but to try to, first of all, get away from institutions where the United States has overfunded things that are not directly in the U.S. interest. And I think there's a presumption a lot of times just as to how much of a strategic impact that withdrawing from certain things will have. And obviously that discussion goes on, but I think it's also reasonable to understand that in a number of different institutions, the U.S. will continue to be a player and will continue, especially where its national security and economic and other interests are involved, continue to focus its efforts on those institutions and making sure its equities are protected there.
And also concerning the latest executive orders, we just saw after Trump's bombshell press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu that the U.S. has placed tight sanctions by executive order on Iran. And one of those stated goals was for Iran not to sell a single drop of oil, including and especially to China. Now, China receives about 1.5 million barrels of oil a day from Iran. How is this going to go down?
Well, it's probably going to be difficult to effectively stop China from purchasing Iran's oil, and this has long been a part of a broader problem, which is that illiberal actors such as Iran have been sustaining themselves in part from Chinese demand. The same has been true with respect to Russia and Russia's use of China as a market for its agricultural goods and its oil and other things. And indeed, you see that in the new BRICS and expanded BRICS structure, looking for ways to escape from vulnerability to U.S. economic sanctions by creating alternative commodity markets, alternative currency clearing transaction. So while it may not be fully successful, I think what you see in the Middle East specifically is an attempt to get back to the type of world that President Trump was working towards in the Abrams Accord, to try to weaken and isolate Iran and build alliances between Saudi Arabia and the moderate Gulf states and others such as Israel, that little by little take away the political space as well as the economic space that Iran has to fund organizations that do terrorism and attack U.S. allies around the world, such as the Houthi rebels, such as the such as Hamas and such as Hezbollah. So I think it's a return to a strategy which was actually working fairly well during the first Trump administration.
Now, if we look at the pivot towards China, the pivot to the east after Japan, we know that the United States has a really big deficit right now. The biggest deficit ever, right? So after Japan, China is the second largest creditor to the United States. Does this financial burden affect the relations between the two countries?
It's an important point, and it's a point that China recognizes. Indeed, over recent years, especially the past decade, as U.S.-China hostilities increase, China has been slowly but very deliberately de-risking and de-leveraging. As a matter of fact, China in 2014 held about $1.2 trillion worth of U.S. treasuries. That number is now down under $800 billion. And so it's little by little trying to move away from that, just as the U.S. is trying to move away from dependence on Chinese technologies in its supply chains. In addition to that, you see China trying to escape vulnerability to U.S. sanctions by alternative mechanisms, trying to internationalize the renminbi or the yuan, collaborating with, again, actors such as Russia, Iran, and others, and indeed moving towards digital currencies that, again, facilitate different options for itself. Having said that, it is still important to recognize that the economic interdependence is substantial, and thus if you had any type of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, such as what could start over Taiwan or other economic shock in general, that given China's enormous debt overhang, as we've seen with the crisis of its real estate sector in recent years, China recognizes that bad things that could happen in the financial system in the West would spill over to it, and things that could happen in the Indo-Pacific could very much also affect Western states.
Certainly. Now, over here in this part of the world, of course, many observers say that one of the keys to ending the war in Ukraine runs through Beijing. Some have said that with one telephone call to Beijing, perhaps Vladimir Putin could be dissuaded to continue his war of aggression against Ukraine. How key is China when it comes to solving the problem that we see in Ukraine, the war, and Russian aggression against our eastern neighbor?
Well, just like China has been relevant, although not fully cooperative with respect to North Korea's nuclear program and lifeline there, you see that China has played a key role in keeping Russia afloat, in purchasing at a steep discount Russian oil and Russian commodities, helping Russia to evade sanctions, supplying war material, sometimes things such as drones, but also military components to the Russian war machine, just to mention a few things. And so certainly China has leverage, and we can recall China's 2023 12-point plan, which was certainly much more favorable than alternatives by the West, although it was really dead on arrival. So the question is that, number one, does President Trump intend to try to leverage China, and does China want to be leveraged? President Trump has certainly indicated that he would like China's help, but at the same time, China does not necessarily have a strategic interest in that war ending, a war that has led Russia to ever greater and greater dependence on China, has led China's traditional rival Russia to be weaker, and thus any type of engage in the world example, leveraging Russian weakness to expand its own position in the Arctic, in Central Asia, in Siberia, and in other places. And so I think there's a delicate game that China is playing. China could have a role, but whether it will actually play a constructive role in helping to bring the end of the war, I think is another question.
Well, there's kind of a paradox there. If you look at the one China policy, the situation with Taiwan, then China would be probably be in its best interest to support the territorial integrity of Ukraine. However, it's choosing to do the opposite. So how will this affect how the United States treats Taiwan and the one China policy?
Well, first of all, China is almost never consistent in terms of international principles. I mean, it's interesting that China fights for principles of international law, while at the same time, when it applies to it in the South and East China Sea with the UNCLOS ruling about a decade ago, China completely dismisses that application of international law. So I'm not sure that China has ever been particularly worried about consistency. But with respect to Taiwan, certainly Beijing has a strong interest, and Xi Jinping has a strong interest in resolving the issue of Taiwanese autonomy before the end of his period in office, whether that's the end of the third period in office that would end in 2027 and coincide with the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army, or perhaps a fourth period in office that could come after that. But certainly, China is working towards putting an end to Taiwanese autonomy, something that I think we have to recognize that on the one hand, while the United States might have a different commitment under President Trump versus President Biden in how it would respond to that, if the PRC was able to fully incorporate Taiwan, the lesson that would send to U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea, and the ability in terms of naval geography of the PRC to extend into the Pacific and threaten U.S. interests in the Pacific all the way to Guam and Hawaii and beyond would be absolutely game-changing.
Well, we do live in interesting times. Let's just hope they're not too interesting. Professor Evan Ellis from the U.S. Army War College, thank you, sir, very much for joining us tonight. We enjoyed your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I did as well. Thanks.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thank you all for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World. Goodbye.